Elam was east of the Tigris River in a mountainous region, and in fact, that's what the name Elam means. It means mountainous, and so it was a vision that Daniel had of something that didn't even exist yet. This vision is so precise in its prophecy of what's going to happen that most of the modernists that will look at this, that will look at Daniel and read this chapter, have come to believe that it had to have been written during the reign of the Maccabees. They will argue that it had to be a later writing because it is so exact in everything that it says about coming world history. The problem, of course, with that idea is that means that the whole book of Daniel is a forgery. That means that when Jesus speaks about Daniel in Matthew, the 24th chapter, that Jesus is referencing a fraudulent book. I don't believe that. I don't believe that for a moment. I don't think you folks believe it. The fact of the matter is, this book, there is some evidence this book existed long before the Maccabees and was considered canonical long before the Maccabees and by the Jews, who were very exact in their preservation of Scripture. And again, a very exact prophecy of everything that's about to unfold for the Jews and for the nation of Babylon. So he sees this first animal. The first animal is the ram, and it symbols, as is described later on, it symbolizes the Medo-Persian Empire. The Medo-Persian Empire had come out of the east. It was out of Mesopotamia. It was even east of Babylon. It came out of the hill country that was to the east of the Mesopotamian plain in modern day, if I remember right, modern day Iran. In the mountainous areas or the hilly areas of modern day Iran, and the Medes came in, and the Persians, and indeed Iran was known as Persia for a long time, and this nation came out of there, and the higher horn, it says, which means the more powerful one, came up last. This matches the history that we know of the Medo-Persian Empire, where the Medes came out and began to conquer early. They were essentially assimilated by the Persians, and the Persians became the dominant group, and they became the de facto ruler of the Medo-Persian Empire. In fact, sometimes it's just simply called the Persian Empire. Most of what we know about this empire comes from the Greeks. The Greeks were not friendly with the Persians. The Persians had been, as you see here, the ram butts north, west, and south. It doesn't east because it already has the east. It came out of the east, but it butts west and north and south. It went all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, to the west. It went all the way to the south. It challenged Egypt, and it went all the way to the north. And of course, if you've ever, some of you have maybe seen the movie The 300, or you've heard about Thermopylae, or you've heard about the Spartans. And their defense of the pass at Thermopylae. And of course, we had the movie The 300, which I've already referenced. And all of that was under the Persians. I don't think that Xerxes looked like the guy in the movie, though. That guy looks a little fruity, in my opinion. and probably Xerxes didn't look like that. But yes, the basic story is factual. The Persians crossed over from northern Turkey into Greece. They were invading Europe. They were going, there was more land to conquer, and they were going to conquer Greece. And so they came into Greece. There again, stretching all the way from India, or Pakistan, what would today I guess be Pakistan, all the way to the Mediterranean, and north all the way into Greece. They went into Macedonia even a little bit, and to the south, of course, all the way down to the border with Egypt. So they held a tremendous area, and as the Bible says, they did the ram did according to his will and became great. And that's exactly right. They were conquering everywhere they went. The interesting thing about the Persians is that they brought a great period of commercial expansion in this area. They effectively founded an empire that was worldwide, or at least of the known world, worldwide at that time. Even Babylon wasn't that big. Even Babylon wasn't that widespread. But the Medo-Persian Empire, the Persians were. They introduced an international language, which was Aramaic. And Aramaic continued to be the international language of this area, even into the time of Jesus. Jesus spoke Aramaic. We know he spoke Aramaic. We've got several words that he spoke during his lifetime in Aramaic. That was his language, his native language. A lot of these folks, of course, also spoke Greek because of the Greek influence. So you had basically two languages competing with one another. The Greeks had a number. The Persians had a number of. I can't get my. Here we go. The Persians also had a number of other innovations. They had a universal coinage. They had a coinage that was good throughout the empire, and so they would use that coinage for trade. And so if you were coming from Pakistan and you wanted to trade with Tyre on the Mediterranean coast, you could use Persian money. It was a great time of commercial expansion. They gave the individual races and nationalities, put them under a central government, but they maintained the rights of those people. Those people still had a right to self-government, which was very, very unusual. At that time, it sounds almost modernistic to say that yes, those folks would be given a right to keep their own government, their own traditions, their own language. In fact, some of them were even allowed to keep their own coinage. The Jews, for example, minted coins during this time. The Persians had a concept of religious freedom. You were free to worship any god you wanted to. Nobody was allowed to interfere with your worship of whatever deity you chose. And it was, a lot of American ideas are found starting here in this Persian Empire, and some of the concepts that they held. Then, though, here comes the second animal. The second animal, as he says here, while I was observing, behold, a male goat was coming out of the west over the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came up to the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing in front of the canal, and rushed at him in his mighty wrath. I saw him come beside the ram, and he was enraged at him, And he struck the ram and shattered his two horns, and the ram had no strength to withstand him, and so he hurled him to the ground and trampled on him, and there was none to rescue the ram from his power. Then the male goat magnified himself exceedingly, but as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken, and in its place there came up four conspicuous horns toward the four winds of heaven. So here we have the male goat. The male goat is later, you'll find out, identified as Greece. It's the Greek Empire. It's the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great, the man we know as Alexander the Great. He brought in a new military tactic called the phalanx. And if you, again, have read your history books, you know that the phalanx was a line of Greek soldiers, each one having a spear about 12 to 14 feet long that they would put in front of them, and then they would also have a shield. They would have a fairly large shield, and that shield would cover their part of them and then the person to their left. And so they would actually form a solid wall of shields with these long spears, and once they got moving, they would be in ranks 10, 12, 14, 16 men deep. And once they got to moving, nobody was going to stand in their way, because here they came with those spears, and in the days of that type of battle, once you broke the enemy line, the enemy would scatter. And that's what the Greeks did. They just simply broke the enemy line with their phalanx and then used their cavalry. They used their cavalry to sweep in and run everybody off. And so the Greeks had this tremendous military advantage. And that's why we see the goat, as described here by Daniel, it comes out of the west, not touching the ground. And the idea of it not touching the ground is because it's moving so fast that it doesn't even touch the ground, is the idea. The speed of the conquest. And of course, we know that the Greeks, the Greek military, the Greek invasion under Alexander the Great conquered all of this area, all of the area of the Persian Empire, conquered all of it in 11 years. In 11 short years, they have completely taken over the Persian Empire. But, as it says here, that great horn is shattered, is broken. Well, what happened? Well, Alexander died of a fever when he got to Persepolis, which is in the Persian Empire, and he died of a fever there, and he left no heir. And so now the kingdom has no known ruler, okay? So these four horns grow up in the place of the great horn. And these are Alexander's generals. And there's Cassander and Ptolemy and Seleucid and another guy whose name I can't remember. But they each took a chunk of the empire. Ptolemy got Egypt. Seleucid got Babylon and Syria and Palestine. Cassander got, I believe, Greece and Macedonia. And then the fourth guy got the land of the west, or to the east, rather, the original Medo-Persian Empire. So these four guys become the rulers. And again, we see this. This is why, again, this book is so challenged by the skeptics, because they, is so incredibly accurate is this prophecy that, it had to be written after the fact. That's just sort of the logic that they use. This had to be written after the fact, because how could anyone know this exact what was going to happen? Well, God knew what was going to happen, and God told Daniel. So then we have another little horn. says verse 9, then out of one of them grew forth a rather small horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. It grew up into the host of heaven and caused some of the hosts and some of the stars to fall from the earth, and it trampled them down. It even magnified itself to be equal to the commander of the host, and removed the regular sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was thrown down. And on account of the transgression, the host will be given over to the horn, which, along with the regular sacrifice, and it will fling truth to the ground, and perform its will and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, another holy one said to that particular one who was speaking, how long will the vision about the regular sacrifice apply? Even the transgression causes horror, so as that both the holy place and the host to be trampled. And he said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the holy place will be properly restored. Now, one of Alexander's generals was Seleucid, or Seleucus Nicanor. He's the one that got, again, that area of Babylon, Syria, and Palestine. The little horn that grew out of his horn is coming from the Greek rulers, and therefore it cannot be the same little horn of chapter 7. Now, people will try and tie those two together somehow, as if the little horn of chapter 7 is the same as the little horn of chapter 8. They are not the same. The little horn of chapter 8 comes out of the Greek Empire. The little horn of chapter 7 came out of the Roman Empire, not the same. Why does God use the same figure for these men? I believe he uses the same figure for these people because they have a similarity of intent and a similarity of action. Not because they are the same person. Again, we understand that the little horn in chapter 7, we think it's probably Domitian. In chapter 8, the little horn is undoubtedly, and everybody agree, all the scholars agree, is a man by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes. The little horn, and he was determined. He was out of the Seleucid group, and he decided he was going to Hellenize. He's going to turn all of these lands, all these folks in these lands, into Greeks. They were all going to be Greek. They were going to have Greek customs, Greek language, Greek gods, and all of that. He was going to determine they were going to be Greek, and including the people of Israel. And so, how do you essentially destroy a person's nationality and replace it with another nationality? Well, you have to get rid of anything that makes them unique in some way. And in this case, he attacked religion. He attacked the Jewish religion. That name, even the name that he uses, Antiochus Epiphanes, means Antiochus the illustrious one, or in some cases, some translators would even render that as Antiochus the holy God. So he placed himself in the place of God, of Jehovah. And he was determined to supplant Jehovah in the minds of the Israelites, of the Jews. The Jews, in turn, called him Antiochus Epimanes, which means Antiochus the madman. They had a very low opinion of him, as you can imagine. We learn that this fellow Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus Epimanes, we found out if we were to read the book of the Maccabees, 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Now, they're not canonical. I don't believe they are inspired. But I believe they are historical. I believe they give a pretty good historical record of some of the events that went on during this time, because the Maccabees ultimately revolted against the Greeks, against Antiochus. This fellow came in, he forbade the Jews to offer their regular sacrifices. This is that abomination of desolation that Daniel speaks about here in verse 11 and 12, verse 11 and 12. And Jesus references this, of course, over in Matthew 24 and verse 10, I think. Maybe not 10. I have to look it up. But anyway, over in Matthew 24, Jesus references this, talking about that abomination of desolation. It was the end of the regular sacrifice, the morning. You remember, remember our study of Leviticus, the Jews were required to do a morning and an evening sacrifice. They were to have the table of showbread out and all of that. And Antiochus came in and said, "Oh no, you're not going to do that anymore." And he polluted the temple to prevent that from happening. He forbade them to offer sacrifices. The king sent letters by the hand of his messengers unto Jerusalem. This is out of Maccabees. Unto Jerusalem and the cities of Judea, that they should follow laws strange to the land, and should forbid the burnt offerings and sacrifice and drink offerings in the sanctuary, and should should profane the Sabbaths and the feasts. He forbade them to observe the Sabbaths, and them that were holy. Antiochus did not actually tear down the temple, but he desecrated it to such a point that even commanding that that swine were to be sacrificed on the altar. That was the level of the pollution. He put up images of himself to be worshipped because he considered himself a god. And we find out that Antiochus's actions precipitated a revolt by the Jews, led by the Judas Maccabee, as a result, they were able to overthrow. They were able to throw off the Greek rule, and they were able to cleanse and reconsecrate the temple, and the events of which are celebrated with their fourth annual feast. And this is that festival of lights, or festival of dedication. And we know that Jesus attended that festival of dedication, as is recorded in John the 10th chapter. So that's Hanukkah. We know that today is Hanukkah. So we've got some Jewish folks who are probably I think even this week, celebrating Hanukkah. That's what they're celebrating, is this rededication of the temple that occurred under the Maccabees, getting rid of the pollution caused by Antiochus. So then we go into the explanation of the vision, all right? And we see in verse 15, when I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it, and behold, standing before me was one who looked like a man. And a voice of a man between the banks of Ulai, and he called out and said, Gabriel, give this man understanding of the vision. So here's Daniel speaking to the angel Gabriel. Now, interestingly enough, in all of the Old Testament, there's only one book that identifies the names of certain angels, and that book is Daniel. There are two angels named, whose given name are included in the text. That is Gabriel in this chapter, and Michael over in chapter 10, which we'll get there. But Daniel's the only book that does that. As he is told there, he says, So I came near to where I was standing, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, Son of man, understand that the vision pertains to the time of the end. So here it is, the time of the end. Now, folks, a lot of folks will grab on that word, that language, and say, oh, the time of the end. So this must mean the end of the world. No, it doesn't mean the end of the world. It's the end of an era, the end of a sequence, if you will. It's not the end of the world, but it is an ending, okay? He says, while I was talking with him, I sank into a deep sleep with my face to the ground, but he touched me and made me stand upright. He said, behold, I am going to let you know what will occur at the final period of the indignation, for it pertains to the appointed time of the end. The end of what? The end of the indignation. Okay, so here is the end of the indignation that God, of course, has been indignant against the Jews for their many failures in observing his law. And here's Daniel then giving this vision, this prophecy of what's going to unfold. He goes on to explain, the ram which you saw were the two horns representing the kings of Media, and Persia. Well, yes, we understood that. This is the Medo-Persian Empire. The shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece. We understood that. And the large horn that between his eyes is the first king. That's Alexander. And we understand. We can gather. We have the advantage of hindsight of history to see if these things are so. The broken horn and the four horns that arose in its place represent four kingdoms which will arise from his nation, though not with his power. And indeed, the four kingdoms that arose did not have the power of Alexander the Great. Though that Greek empire began to splinter apart under these four kings who couldn't help but squabble among themselves. And the Ptolemies, especially the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, were fighting against each other nearly constantly. And we'll read about that more in later chapters. We'll read more about these squabbling between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, because since, guess what? Israel is right there sort of on the border between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. Since Israel's right there, that becomes a key traffic way for the armies that are moving north or south to fight against each other. So we'll read about that later. It says, in the latter period of their rule, when the transgressors have run their course, a king will arise, insolent and skilled in intrigue. His power will be mighty, but not by his own power. He will destroy to an extraordinary degree and prosper and perform his will. He will destroy mighty men and the holy people. And through his shrewdness, he will cause deceit to succeed by his influence, and he will magnify himself in his heart, and he will destroy many while they are at ease. And he'll even oppose the prince of princes, but he will be broken without human agency. The vision of the mornings, the vision of the evenings and the mornings which have been told is true, but keep the vision secret, for it pertains to many days in the future. Couple of things on that passage. First of all, Antiochus was infamous for his intrigues. He was a schemer. He was a first-class. Plotter. He would destroy his opponents when they thought they were safe. He would frequently use either traitors. He would bribe folks, or he would get infiltrators to conduct assassinations. That was one of his favorite tactics. Here's a ruler that opposes me. Well, I'll get somebody to kill him. We'll just do an assassination, and I'll be rid of him. And so he was constantly plotting for that kind of chaos within the world governments. What happened was, during the Maccabean revolt, Antiochus was unable to pay his. He ran out of money. He was not. All of this intrigue, all of this warring going on constantly was expensive, and he ran out of money, and he couldn't pay his soldiers. So then, when the Maccabees began their revolt in Israel, and he tried to send his army there, they told him, no, we're not going. You didn't pay us, we're not going. So then he attempted to rob a temple of Nanayan. I'm not sure who that is, but it's a Mesopotamian deity. Some scholars would point to her as being sort of an equivalent of Artemis, the Greek Artemis or the Roman Diana. Sort of greatest Diana of the Ephesians. We remember that from the book of Acts. Or greatest Artemis, that was her other name. Well, this Nanania, or whatever her name is, was sort of the Mesopotamian version of this same deity. Okay, he attempted to rob her temple. He was repelled. The scripture goes on to say then, as it says here, in verse, he will be broken without human agency. That's in verse 25. It says he will oppose even the Prince of Princes. Yes, he declared himself to be God, equivalent to Jehovah God. And he will be destroyed without human hand. He was destroyed without human hand. I'm out of time, though. I'll tell you about that next week. So sort of stay tuned. Yes. Yeah. I think there's several things here that we see. First of all, we understand when Jesus talks about in Matthew 24, he talks about when you see the abomination of desolation, we can know exactly what that abomination of desolation means because we can see what happened in Daniel. What happened? They stopped the sacrifice. They stopped the daily sacrifice. They forbade the Sabbath. Basically, Jesus says, you're going to see the same thing happen. And the Romans did. The Romans prevented the daily sacrifice. And Jesus gave them the warning. When you see that happen, get out. And so it becomes, in that sense, it became a warning, a very graphic warning to the Christian Jews, Jewish Christians. Okay? All right, we'll stop there and we'll continue next week. Thank you for your attention.